The soft hum of tires against pavement echoed in the quiet night as Julian Coleman, a composed and respected 48-year-old, navigated Sycamore Avenue. The day had been long, but fulfilling, filled with meetings alongside Charlotte's community leaders. His modest black sedan blended into the suburban landscape, and his mind drifted to the comforting thought of his wife's famous pot roast waiting at home. But his peaceful drive was abruptly interrupted when blue and red lights flared in his rearview mirror, slicing through the darkness with an unspoken demand. Julian's fingers instinctively tightened around the steering wheel. A quick glance at the speedometer. 29 in a 35 miles per hour zone. No violations, no broken lights. Yet the wail of the siren persisted. Taking a steadying breath, he signaled and guided his car to the curb, instinctively running through the well-worn protocol in his mind. Hands visible, movements deliberate, demeanor polite. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. A beam of white light sliced through his car window as the first officer approached with brisk authority. Another officer hovered near the rear bumper, fingers lightly grazing his holstered weapon. The lead officer's voice was sharp. "In a hurry tonight?" The tone dripped with suspicion. "No, sir. Just heading home," Julian replied evenly. The flashlight lingered too long on his face before sweeping over his lap. His console, then back up. "License and registration," came the clipped order, ignoring Julian's response altogether. Julian moved deliberately. "I'm retrieving my registration from the glove box now. My license is in my wallet. I'll reach for it next." His voice remained steady, narrating his actions, knowing any sudden movement could escalate the situation. The officer's stance tightened. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" The question was rhetorical. Julian could hear it in the officer's tone. Before he could answer, the officer continued, "You were swerving, driving erratically." Julian frowned. "With all due respect, sir, I wasn't. My dash cam can verify that." The officer's demeanor shifted, hostility sharpening in his gaze. "Dash cam, huh? That's getting confiscated. Step out of the vehicle." The sudden escalation set off alarm bells in Julian's mind. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I'm complying fully." The officer's jaw tensed. "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." Julian swallowed his frustration and unbuckled his seatbelt, moving cautiously as he pushed the door open, hands raised. The second officer moved in aggressively, gripping Julian's arm and yanking him toward the patrol car. "Is this really necessary?" Julian asked, keeping his voice level despite the indignation churning inside him. Resisting, the first officer sneered. "You want to play it that way? Fine by me." The cold bite of metal clamped around Julian's wrists. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was something far worse. As they forced him into the back of the patrol car, he caught sight of neighbors peeking through their blinds, silhouetted against dim porch lights. No one stepped outside, but this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The squad car rumbled down the road, the streetlights casting rhythmic flashes over Julian's face. He sat stiffly in the back seat, his mind racing. Up front, the two officers chuckled, exchanging casual remarks as if they hadn't just detained an innocent man. So, Officer Daniels, the younger of the two, glanced at Julian in the rearview mirror, his smirk evident in his voice. "What's your story? Late night drug run? Or just giving us a hard time?" Julian held his gaze, unflinching. "I'm just a man trying to get home." Daniel scoffed. "Yeah, sure. Heard that one before." His partner, Officer Reed, chuckled. "Reckless drivers always have an excuse." Julian exhaled slowly, reining in his anger. He knew better than to argue, knew the odds were stacked against him in this moment. He focused instead on what came next. At the precinct, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Daniels removed Julian's cuffs with a mocking flourish. "Welcome to your new home for the night." Julian flexed his sore wrists. "Am I being charged with something?" His voice remained composed. Reed smirked. "We'll let you know once we figure that out. Sit tight." They locked him in a holding cell, the heavy door clanging shut. Julian sat on the cold bench, his expression unreadable. He wasn't just some unlucky civilian. He understood the system intimately. He had worked tirelessly to change it, and now he was on the other side of the very injustice he had spent his career fighting. Beyond the bars, the officers laughed, flipping through Julian's documents. "Nothing special here," Daniels muttered, sounding almost disappointed. "Doesn't matter. Reed shrugged. Guys like him always have skeletons. We'll find something. Julian heard them. He didn't react. He was patient. He knew how this played out. The hours dragged on. Other officers passed by, some glancing curiously at him. None recognized him. That would change soon enough. He had only been in the city for 3 weeks, but his presence would soon be known. As dawn stretched golden hues across the sky, approaching footsteps broke the silence. A new officer, a woman with sharp eyes and an air of authority, stopped in front of his cell. Her badge read, Lieutenant Morgan. Unlike the others, she radiated professionalism. Her eyes flicked between Julian and the report in her hands. What's going on here? She asked, her tone clipped. Daniel straightened. Picked him up last night. Reckless driving. Resisting arrest. Morgan raised a brow. Reckless driving? You have proof. Reed crossed his arms. We haven't processed it yet. Morgan's lips pressed into a thin line. Let's review his dash cam. Now, in Daniel's Reed, my office. Immediately, the 2 officers shifted uneasily before obeying. Julian watched silently. The tides were shifting. Minutes later, Morgan returned, her expression unreadable. She gestured for him to step forward. We reviewed your dash cam footage. Your account checks out completely. This should never have happened. Julian remained composed. So I'm free to go? Morgan nodded. Yes, but I'd like to discuss next steps. Privately, seated across from her desk, Julian took in the Spartan office. Just a desk, 2 chairs, and a file cabinet. No distractions, just business. I'll be filing a report against Daniels and Reed, Morgan stated, her tone firm. Then she hesitated. But I have to ask, who are you really? You're too composed for someone who just spent the night in holding over nothing. Julian allowed himself a small, measured smile. Let's just say I've been in situations like this before. I've learned to stay calm. Morgan studied him, then nodded. Fair enough, but something tells me this isn't over. As Julian stepped out of the precinct, the morning sun warmed his skin, but the weight of the night lingered. This wasn't just an injustice. It was a lesson, and he had every intention of making sure it wouldn't be ignored. Julian didn't head straight home. Instead, he drove to his office, parked in his reserved space, and walked through the doors of the police headquarters he now oversaw. His assistant, Anita, looked up from her desk, startled. Chief Coleman, you're here early. Julian gave her a nod, his expression neutral. It's been a long night, Anita. Could you prepare a briefing room for me? I need to address the department this afternoon. Anita nodded quickly, sensing the gravity in his tone. As Julian stepped into his office and closed the door behind him, he exhaled deeply. He knew what was coming. This wasn't just about him. It was about what his experience represented. The public trusted him to lead, to protect, and to hold others accountable. That responsibility weighed heavily, but Julian welcomed it. However, before he could act, there was one more storm to weather. The courtroom, where everything would come to light. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread quickly about the case, and local media outlets were eager to cover it. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but that didn't stop reporters from lining the courthouse steps, ready to pounce as soon as the hearing adjourned. Julian sat quietly at the defendant's table, his lawyer, Sandra Reyes, flipping through a thick folder of evidence. Sandra was a force to be reckoned with. Sharp, unrelenting, and known for dismantling weak arguments with surgical precision. Across the room, officers Daniels and Reed sat with their department-appointed attorney. Daniels looked nervous, his foot tapping uncontrollably, while Reed tried to appear unfazed, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression. The judge, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor, entered the room and called the session to order. We are here today to address the charges brought against Mr. Julian Coleman. Prosecution, you may proceed. The prosecutor, a young and somewhat hesitant lawyer, stood and began outlining the case. As it was initially reported, on the night in question, the defendant was observed driving recklessly, swerving into another lane. Upon being stopped by officers Daniels and Reed, he became uncooperative and resisted arrest. Sandra barely suppressed a smile. She leaned over to Julian and whispered, "They're walking right into it." When it was her turn, Sandra stood confidently, her voice commanding the room. "Your Honor, the charges against my client are not only baseless, but are also a direct result of racial profiling and abuse of power. To prove this, I'd like to present video evidence that directly contradicts the officer's statements." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Sandra gestured to the bailiff, who dimmed the lights and began playing the dashcam footage. The room fell silent as the video showed Julian driving steadily within his lane, the speedometer reading a constant 29 miles per hour. The officer's patrol car, visible in the rearview mirror, turned on its lights without cause. Next came the body cam footage. The courtroom watched as the officers approached Julian's car, their aggressive tone evident from the start. The footage revealed Daniels muttering under his breath, another one of them causing trouble, followed by Reed chuckling and replying, "Figures." Gasps rippled through the audience. The judge's brow furrowed deeply as he glanced at the officers. Sandra paused the video and addressed the court. "This is the professionalism displayed by officers Daniels and Reed? Now, let's fast forward to the arrest itself." The footage continued, showing Julian complying calmly, narrating his movements as he retrieved his registration and license. The contrast between his composed demeanor and the officer's hostility was stark. By the time the video finished, the courtroom was tense. Sandra turned to the jury. "This is not just an abuse of power. This is a direct violation of my client's rights, rooted in bias and prejudice." The prosecutor stood, visibly flustered. The officers believed they had probable cause. Sandra cut in sharply. Probable cause based on what? Driving safely? Following instructions? Or perhaps it was the color of his skin. The judge banged his gavel lightly. "Let's keep this focused." Sandra's voice softened, but her words were no less powerful. "Your Honor, before we proceed further, my client has something to share with the court." Julian stood, adjusting his tie. He scanned the room, making eye contact with the officers before addressing the judge. "My name is Julian Coleman," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm the chief of police for this city. I was appointed 3 weeks ago to lead this department and address the very issues you've seen here today. I chose not to disclose my position early because I wanted the truth to come out organically, without bias or interference. And now it has." The room erupted in murmurs. Daniel's face turned pale, while Reed's smugness evaporated in an instant. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding silence. Julian continued, "This isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows officers like Daniels and Reed to operate without accountability. That ends now." The courtroom buzzed with tension as Julian took his seat, his final words hanging in the air like a thunderclap. Daniels and Reed sat frozen, their expressions a mixture of shock and fear. The judge called for a brief recess, giving everyone time to absorb what had just transpired. By the time the session resumed, the tone had shifted completely. The prosecution offered no further arguments, and the judge dismissed the charges against Julian immediately. But that was only the beginning. As Julian stepped outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. "Chief Coleman, do you have a statement about the case?" one called out. Julian raised his hand, signaling for silence. The crowd stilled, eager for his response. "This case isn't just about me," he began, his voice steady and resolute. "It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of who they are, is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. As a police chief, I'm committed to creating a department that values integrity and fairness. And as a citizen, I will continue to fight for justice." The media frenzy continued, but Julian didn't linger. He had more important matters to address. The fallout from the case was swift. Daniels and Reed were immediately suspended pending an internal investigation. Public outrage grew as the footage was released to the press, sparking protests and calls for reform. Community leaders rallied together, demanding greater transparency and better training for officers. Within the department, Julian's leadership took on new significance. He called an emergency meeting, gathering officers in the precinct. Standing at the front of the room, he addressed them with unwavering conviction. "What happened to me last night wasn't an isolated incident," Julian said, scanning the room. "It was a symptom of a larger problem, and as long as I'm chief, I won't tolerate it. We are here to serve and protect, not to harass and intimidate. If you can't uphold those values, this isn't the place for you." The room was silent. His words cut through any lingering doubt about his intentions. Over the following weeks, Julian implemented sweeping changes: mandatory bias training, stricter oversight, and an anonymous reporting system for officer misconduct. The community began to see a shift, though trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. For Julian, the battle wasn't over, but it was a fight worth having, and he was ready. As the town hall emptied and the night settled in, Julian stood firm, knowing this was just the beginning. Change wasn't about one case, one leader, or one moment. It was about a movement. The fight for justice doesn't end in a courtroom or a precinct. It lives in every choice we make, every voice that refuses to be silenced. The truth had come to light, but what mattered now was what came next. Because real change isn't promised, it's fought for. And as long as injustice exists, the fight will go on. The question is, who will stand and fight?